James Miller had worked at the palace for almost 12 years. He started as a junior guard when he was just 23, fresh out of military service with dreams of serving something greater than himself. The royal household seemed like the perfect place for a young man who valued duty and tradition. Over the years, he had seen countless faces come and go, witnessed grand ceremonies and quiet moments alike, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover on that cold November morning. The shift had begun like any other. James arrived at the staff entrance at 5 in the morning, just as the first hints of dawn were breaking over London. He greeted the night guards who were finishing their rounds, collected his assignment sheet, and began his patrol route through the east wing of the palace. This section of the building was usually quiet at this hour, housing mostly administrative offices and some private rooms used by senior members of the royal family when they stayed overnight during busy periods. As James walked the familiar corridors, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble floors, he noticed something unusual. A door that was normally locked stood slightly ajar. It was the entrance to one of the private sitting rooms, a space that had once belonged to the late Queen Elizabeth. Since her passing, the room had been kept as something of a shrine, carefully maintained but rarely entered. Only a few trusted staff members had keys, and visits were typically scheduled and logged. James felt his pulse quicken. His training immediately kicked in. An open door in a secured area could mean many things, none of them good. It could be a simple mistake, someone forgetting to lock up properly, or it could be something more serious. Break-ins at the palace were rare but not unheard of, and security protocols were strict for good reason. He approached carefully, one hand moving instinctively to his radio. The door was heavy oak, ornately carved, and it swung open silently on well-oiled hinges. James peered inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. The room looked undisturbed at first glance. Antique furniture sat in perfect arrangement. Oil paintings hung straight on the walls, and the Persian rug showed no signs of disturbance. Then he heard it. A soft sound like fabric rustling. Someone was in the room. James stepped inside, his heart pounding now. His eyes scanned the shadows, and then he saw her. A figure stood near the large mahogany desk in the corner, bent over something that gleamed even in the low light. As his eyes focused, James recognized the person immediately. It was Queen Camilla. For a moment, James froze. Protocol dictated that he should announce himself, but seeing a member of the royal family in a restricted area at this hour left him uncertain. Camilla was wearing casual clothes, not her usual formal attire, and she seemed deeply absorbed in whatever she was doing. She had not noticed him yet. James cleared his throat softly. Camilla jumped, spinning around with a gasp. In her hands was an ornate jewelry box, one that James recognized from palace inventory photographs. It was not just any jewelry box. This particular piece had belonged to Queen Elizabeth herself and contained some of her most treasured personal items. The box was part of a collection that had been carefully catalogued and secured after her death, items designated for the royal archive and eventual public display. The queen consort stood there, caught in the beam of early morning light now streaming through a gap in the curtains. Her face showed a mixture of surprise and something else James could not quite identify. Guilt, perhaps? Or was it something more complicated? The jewelry box remained clutched in her hands, its lid open to reveal glittering contents inside. James found his voice, though it came out more uncertain than he intended. He addressed her formally as protocol demanded, asking if everything was all right. Camilla did not respond immediately. She looked down at the box in her hands, then back at James. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. James knew he had stumbled into something significant. The late Queen's personal effects were sacred ground in the palace. They represented not just monetary value, but historical and sentimental importance to the nation. Every item had been carefully inventoried, every piece accounted for. The protocol for handling these items was strict and well documented. No one, not even senior members of the royal family, was supposed to access them without proper authorization and documentation. Camilla finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. She told James that she could explain, that this was not what it looked like. But even as she said the words, her hands trembled slightly. James noticed other items spread across the desk behind her. More jewelry, what looked like personal letters, and several small boxes he recognized as part of the archived collection. James felt torn. His duty was clear. Any irregularity involving the palace's treasures had to be reported immediately. But standing before him was not just anyone. This was the Queen Consort, wife of King Charles, a senior member of the royal family. The implications of what he had witnessed were enormous, and he knew that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond this quiet morning encounter. He reached for his radio, his hand shaking slightly. Camilla took a step forward, still holding the jewelry box. She spoke again, more urgently this time, asking James to wait, to let her explain before he called anyone. But James had already made his decision. His finger pressed the button on his radio, and his voice, though wavering, requested immediate backup in the East Wing sitting room. He reported a security situation requiring senior staff attention. The words hung in the air between them. Camilla's expression changed, the initial surprise giving way to resignation. She set the jewelry box down carefully on the desk and stepped back, her hands now empty and visible. James maintained his position near the door, his training keeping him focused despite the surreal nature of the situation. Within minutes, he could hear footsteps approaching rapidly down the corridor. Other guards were coming, and with them, senior security personnel. Whatever was happening here was about to become official, documented and impossible to undo. The morning that had started so ordinarily had transformed into something that would shake the foundations of the palace and capture the attention of the entire nation. The first person to arrive was Chief Security Officer Margaret Hayes, a woman in her 50s with 30 years of palace service behind her. She had seen many unusual situations in her career, but the scene that greeted her in the East Wing sitting room left her momentarily speechless. Queen Camilla stood near the antique desk, her posture rigid and defensive. Guard James Miller waited by the door, his face pale but determined. Between them, spread across the polished wood surface, lay a collection of jewelry and personal items that belonged in the secure archive, not in the hands of anyone, royal or otherwise. Margaret's mind raced as she took in the situation. Her training told her to secure the items first, ask questions later. But the presence of the Queen Consort complicated everything. She could not simply treat this as a standard security breach. Yet she also could not ignore what was clearly a serious violation of protocol. The items on the desk represented not just financial value but irreplaceable historical significance. Camilla spoke first, her voice carrying the authority of her position but also an undertone of something vulnerable. She explained that she had come to the room early this morning because she could not sleep. She had been thinking about the late Queen, about memories and conversations they had shared. She claimed she only wanted to look at a few items to feel close to Elizabeth again. The anniversary of the Queen's passing was approaching, and Camilla said she had been feeling the weight of that loss more heavily in recent days. Margaret listened carefully, her expression neutral. She understood grief and the strange ways it could manifest, but understanding did not change the facts. The room was supposed to be secured. The items had strict handling protocols. Even if Camilla's intentions were innocent, her actions had violated established procedures. And there was another problem. How had Camilla accessed the room? The lock showed no signs of forced entry, which meant she must have used a key. Keys to this particular room were tightly controlled and logged. More footsteps echoed in the corridor. Deputy Private Secretary Andrew Thornton arrived, followed closely by 2 additional security guards. Andrew was a meticulous man who had served the royal household for 20 years. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His first action was to close and lock the door, ensuring privacy. Whatever was discussed here needed to stay contained, at least for now. Andrew asked Camilla directly about the key. She hesitated before answering, then admitted that she had borrowed it from the household office 3 days ago. She had signed it out under her name, though she had not specified which room she intended to access or when. The key log would show her signature, but it would also show that she was supposed to return the key the same day. Instead, she had kept it, planning to visit the room when she knew she would not be disturbed. This admission changed the situation significantly. Camilla had not simply stumbled into the room by accident or used unauthorized access. She had deliberately planned this visit, albeit for personal and emotional reasons. The question now was how to handle it. Andrew exchanged a glance with Margaret. Both understood that this incident could not be swept under the rug. but they also knew that mishandling it could create a public relations disaster. James Miller remained standing by the door, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. He had done his duty by reporting the situation, but now he found himself witness to a conversation that felt far above his rank. He wondered if he should leave, but Margaret had not dismissed him. Perhaps she wanted a neutral witness present, someone who could verify what was being said. Andrew began asking more specific questions. He asked Camilla to account for each item on the desk. She pointed to a pearl necklace, explaining that Elizabeth had worn it during a private dinner years ago, shortly after Camilla's marriage to Charles. The Queen had shared stories about the necklace's history that evening, stories Camilla wanted to remember. She gestured to a small leather-bound journal, saying it contained notes in Elizabeth's handwriting, thoughts about family and duty that Camilla felt drawn to revisit. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its surface, but Andrew pressed further. Why had she not requested official access through proper channels? Why the secrecy? Why at 5 a.m? Camilla's answers became less certain. She admitted that she feared being denied permission, or being judged for her desire to connect with these items. She worried that people would not understand her grief, that they would see her request as inappropriate or presumptuous. Margaret spoke up, her tone professional but firm. She explained that regardless of the reasons, protocols existed for important purposes. The items in this room were part of the nation's heritage. They needed to be protected, documented, and preserved. Even the Queen Consort could not simply help herself to them, no matter how personal her connection might be. The rules applied to everyone, and exceptions would set dangerous precedents. Camilla's composure began to crack. She sat down heavily in one of the antique chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She acknowledged that she had made a mistake. She said she had not meant to cause trouble or violate protocols. She had simply wanted a moment of connection with someone she had lost, someone whose approval and guidance she had valued deeply. The emotion in her voice was genuine, and for a moment the room fell silent. Andrew and Margaret stepped aside for a private conversation. They spoke in low voices, weighing their options. This situation required delicate handling. On one hand, they had a clear protocol violation. On the other, they had the Queen Consort in obvious distress, claiming emotional rather than criminal motives. The decision they made in the next few minutes would have far-reaching consequences. James watched from his position by the door. He felt a strange mixture of sympathy and duty. Camilla looked vulnerable in a way he had never seen any royal family member appear. But he also knew he had been right to call for help. Something irregular was happening, and it needed to be addressed properly, no matter who was involved. Margaret returned to the desk and began carefully photographing each item with her phone, documenting their exact positions. Andrew made notes on his tablet, recording everything that had been said. This was now an official incident, and it would need to be reported up the chain of command. The question was how high that report would need to go, and how quickly word would spread through the palace. Camilla asked what would happen next. Andrew explained that he would need to inform the king's private secretary, and likely the king himself. There would be an internal review of security protocols and access procedures. The incident would be documented, though Andrew assured her that they would handle the matter with discretion. However, he could not promise complete secrecy. Too many people already knew something unusual had occurred. As Margaret finished securing the items back in their proper containers, preparing to return them to the archive, James received a message on his radio. Other guards were asking questions about the situation. Word was already beginning to spread through the security team. Margaret instructed James to inform his colleagues that the situation was under control and required no further immediate action. But she knew that containing information within the palace was like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Slowly but inevitably, it would seep through. By midday, the palace was buzzing with whispers and speculation. Despite efforts to maintain confidentiality, news of the early morning incident had spread through the staff like wildfire. Housekeepers exchanged knowing glances in the corridors. Kitchen staff huddled together during breaks, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations. Security guards spoke in hushed tones, comparing what they had heard from James Miller with their own theories about what had really happened. Sarah Jenkins, who had worked in the household office for 15 years, was the first to notice that something was seriously wrong. She arrived for her shift at 8 and immediately sensed tension in the air. Margaret Hayes had requested all key logs from the past week, an unusual demand that suggested an audit or investigation. When Sarah pulled the records, she saw Camilla's signature next to a key checkout 3 days prior, with no corresponding return entry. Her heart sank. She knew this would be a problem. By noon, King Charles had been informed. He canceled his afternoon appointments and requested an immediate meeting with Andrew Thornton and Margaret Hayes. The meeting took place in his private study, away from curious eyes and ears. Those who saw him emerge an hour later noted that his expression was troubled, his usual composed demeanor cracked by visible strain. He spoke briefly with his personal secretary before retreating to his private apartments. The official investigation began that afternoon. Margaret assembled a small team of trusted security personnel to review access logs, interview relevant staff members, and piece together a complete timeline of events. James Miller was called in for a formal statement. He sat in a small office recounting every detail of his discovery for the third time that day. His hand still trembled slightly as he described finding Camilla with the jewelry box, the moment he had pressed his radio button, the look on her face when backup arrived. Other witnesses were interviewed as well. A night guard named Thomas Wright recalled seeing someone in the East Wing corridor around 4:30 that morning. He had assumed it was a senior staff member preparing for early duties and had not thought to investigate further. A housekeeper named Patricia Moore reported that she had found the sitting room door unlocked 2 mornings ago when she came to dust. She had locked it herself, thinking someone had simply forgotten. Now she wondered if that oversight had been deliberate. Meanwhile, Camilla remained in her private quarters, meeting with advisors and lawyers. The palace communications team gathered to discuss how to handle the situation if word leaked to the press. They drafted several potential statements, each one carefully worded to minimize damage while acknowledging that an incident had occurred. The challenge was balancing transparency with protecting the royal family's reputation and privacy. By late afternoon, rumors had reached the ears of junior press officers stationed at the palace. One of them, Emma Blackwell, received a text from a friend who worked in security, hinting that something big had happened involving the Queen Consort. Emma debated whether to inform her supervisor. On one hand, early warning might help the communications team prepare. On the other hand, spreading unconfirmed information could make things worse. She ultimately decided to mention it casually to her manager during their daily briefing. The communications director, Richard Sterling, immediately recognized the potential crisis. He contacted Andrew Thornton, demanding to know the full details so his team could develop an appropriate response strategy. Andrew was reluctant to share too much, citing the ongoing investigation, but he acknowledged that the situation was serious and potentially damaging if not handled correctly. As evening approached, Margaret Hayes presented her preliminary findings to King Charles and his senior advisors. The facts were clear and undisputed. Camilla had taken a key without proper authorization for its intended use. She had accessed a restricted room at an unusual hour. She had handled items that were part of the royal archive without following established protocols. Whether her intentions were innocent or not, the breach of procedure was significant. The meeting grew heated as advisors debated the appropriate response. Some argued for a private reprimand and improved security measures moving forward. Others insisted that such a serious violation demanded more formal consequences, regardless of who was involved. The king listened to all perspectives, his face grave. He understood that this was not just about his wife. It was about maintaining the integrity of the protocols that protected the nation's heritage. Meanwhile, James Miller went home after his shift, exhausted and anxious. He replayed the morning's events in his mind, wondering if he had done the right thing. Part of him felt guilty for putting the Queen Consort in such a difficult position. Another part felt proud that he had upheld his duty without fear or favoritism. His wife noticed his distraction over dinner and asked what was wrong. James hesitated, bound by confidentiality agreements, then simply said he had experienced a challenging situation at work that he could not discuss. Back at the palace, staff members whispered about what consequences Camilla might face. Some felt sympathy for her, understanding that grief could drive people to act out of character. Others were less forgiving, arguing that rules existed for everyone and that royal status should not exempt anyone from accountability. The division of opinion created an uncomfortable atmosphere throughout the household. Late that night, a junior reporter for a tabloid newspaper received an anonymous tip. The message was vague but intriguing, suggesting that something scandalous had occurred at the palace involving a senior royal and the late queen's possessions. The reporter, always hungry for a good story, began making calls to contacts within the palace staff. Most refused to comment or claimed ignorance, but one source, speaking on condition of anonymity, confirmed that there had been some kind of security incident and that an investigation was underway. The reporter worked through the night, trying to verify details and build a story substantial enough to publish. Meanwhile, the palace communications team remained unaware that their worst fear was beginning to materialize. The story was getting out slowly but surely, and once it reached the public, there would be no way to control the narrative completely. Inside the palace walls, Margaret Hayes reviewed security footage from the East Wing, looking for any additional evidence or context that might explain the situation more fully. The footage showed Camilla entering the corridor at exactly 4:42 in the morning. She walked purposefully, carrying nothing but a small handbag. She unlocked the sitting room door and disappeared inside. 23 minutes later, James Miller appeared, approached the open door and entered. The timeline matched everyone's statements perfectly, but Margaret noticed something else in the footage. 2 days earlier, at roughly the same early morning hour, Camilla had made another visit to that corridor. She had stood outside the sitting room door for several minutes without entering, as if building up courage or reconsidering her decision. Then she had walked away. This suggested that her actions were not impulsive, but had been considered and planned over time. The discovery added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. As the clock struck midnight, marking the end of one of the longest and most stressful days in recent palace history, decisions had to be made. The king needed to determine how to address the situation with Camilla personally. The security team needed to recommend changes to prevent similar incidents. The communications team needed to prepare for potential press inquiries. And everyone involved needed to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that even in the most carefully controlled environment, human emotions and actions could create chaos that no amount of protocol could fully prevent. The next morning brought new revelations that would reshape everyone's understanding of the incident. Dr. Helena Morrison, the palace archivist and curator of the royal collection, was called in to examine the items that Camilla had been handling. Helena had worked with these pieces extensively during the cataloging process after Queen Elizabeth's death. She knew their history intimately and could provide context that might prove crucial to understanding what had really happened. As Helena examined the jewelry box and its contents spread across the table in the secure archive room, she made an unexpected observation. Several of these items were not technically part of the official royal collection. They were personal effects that the late queen had kept separate from state jewels and ceremonial pieces. The pearl necklace, for instance, had never appeared in any official inventory. It was a private gift from Prince Philip on their 30th wedding anniversary, something Elizabeth had treasured personally, but never worn to public events. Helena pulled out her detailed notes and cross-referenced them with the official archive records. The leather journal Camilla had been holding was indeed listed in the archive, but with a special notation. According to Helena's records, Queen Elizabeth had left specific instructions regarding several personal items. Some were to be preserved for historical purposes, others were designated for family members. The journal in particular had a handwritten note from Elizabeth stating that it should be given to Camilla at an appropriate time after her death. This discovery stunned Margaret Hayes and Andrew Thornton. They had assumed Camilla had no legitimate claim to the items she had been handling. But if Elizabeth had actually intended for some of these pieces to go to Camilla, the situation became far more complicated. The question was whether Camilla had known about these instructions and, if so, why she had not simply requested the items through proper channels. Helena continued her examination, finding more interesting details. The small boxes contained letters that Elizabeth had written but never sent, drafts of thoughts she wanted to express to various family members. One envelope was addressed to Camilla directly, sealed but never delivered. Helena handled it carefully, recognizing that its contents might be deeply personal and potentially relevant to understanding Camilla's actions. King Charles was informed immediately of these findings. He sat in quiet contemplation for several minutes after hearing the news. His mother had left messages for Camilla, items she wanted her daughter-in-law to have, but somehow this information had never been properly communicated. He felt a wave of sadness mixed with frustration. How had such important wishes been overlooked in the chaos and grief following Elizabeth's death? Andrew Thornton reviewed the archive processing procedures from the months following the Queen's death. It became clear that in the overwhelming task of cataloging thousands of items, the personal notes and specific bequests had been filed separately and not immediately communicated to the relevant family members. The system had failed, and this failure had created the circumstances that led to the current crisis. A new interview was scheduled with Camilla. This time the tone was different. Instead of treating her as someone who had violated protocols, the investigators approached her with questions about what she might have known regarding Elizabeth's intentions. Camilla sat across from Andrew and Margaret, her expression weary but more open than during their previous encounter. She explained that in the months before Elizabeth's death, the late Queen had mentioned wanting to leave certain personal items to Camilla. Elizabeth had specifically talked about the journal, saying it contained thoughts about navigating royal duties as a woman who had married into the family. She thought these reflections might help Camilla in her role. Elizabeth had also promised that Camilla would receive some personal jewelry pieces, items with sentimental rather than state significance. After Elizabeth's death, Camilla had waited for these items to be delivered. Weeks passed, then months. She assumed that perhaps Elizabeth had changed her mind, or that she had misunderstood the intentions. She felt awkward asking about it directly, not wanting to appear greedy or presumptuous, but the knowledge that these items existed somewhere in the palace, possibly containing messages meant for her, weighed heavily on her mind. Several weeks ago, Camilla had learned about the location of the sitting room and its contents through a conversation with a long-serving palace staff member who had helped with the initial archiving. The staff member mentioned in passing that many of the late Queen's personal items were stored there. Camilla's curiosity and longing grew stronger. She began to obsess over the idea that somewhere in that room were words and objects meant specifically for her, messages from a woman whose approval and guidance she had valued deeply. The decision to take the key and visit the room herself came from a combination of grief, frustration, and impatience. She knew it was wrong to bypass official procedures, but she rationalized that she was only looking for items that were rightfully hers. She had not intended to take anything without permission. She simply wanted to see them, to read whatever Elizabeth had written, to hold pieces that connected her to a relationship that had meant so much. As she spoke, Andrew and Margaret began to see the incident in a new light. This was not a case of theft or malicious intent. It was a tragedy of miscommunication and bureaucratic failure. Elizabeth had made provisions for Camilla, but those provisions had gotten lost in the complex machinery of royal protocol. Camilla, grieving and unsure how to navigate the system, had made a poor choice in trying to access what she believed was rightfully hers. Helena Morrison was asked to search through all remaining archive notes for any other specific bequests or instructions that might have been missed. She discovered several more instances where Elizabeth had left detailed wishes about personal items going to various family members. A comprehensive list was compiled, showing that the oversight regarding Camilla's items was part of a larger systemic problem, rather than an isolated incident. The sealed letter addressed to Camilla became a focal point of discussion. Should it be opened now, or should protocol be followed that might delay its delivery further? King Charles made the decision himself. He authorized the letter to be given to Camilla immediately, along with the other items that his mother had designated for her. Whatever his mother had wanted to say to his wife, she deserved to receive those words without further delay. When Camilla finally held the letter in her hands, she broke down in tears. The envelope felt like a bridge to someone she had lost, a final gift from a woman who had shown her kindness, despite the complicated history of their relationship. She read the letter privately, but later shared that Elizabeth had written words of encouragement and understanding, acknowledging the challenges of royal life and expressing confidence in Camilla's ability to fulfill her duties with grace. The investigation took on a different character after these revelations. While Camilla had still violated protocols, the context mattered. She had not been trying to steal from the royal collection. She had been trying to claim something that was rightfully hers but had been inadvertently withheld. The question now was how to address the procedural violations while acknowledging the legitimate grievance that had motivated them. The story finally broke in the press 3 days after the incident. A tabloid ran a front-page headline that screamed about the Queen consort being caught with the late Queen's jewelry. The article was filled with speculation and unnamed sources, painting a picture of scandal and possible theft. Within hours, every major news outlet in Britain and around the world had picked up the story. Social media exploded with opinions, theories, and outrage. The palace communications team went into crisis mode. Richard Sterling and his staff worked frantically to craft a response that would address the situation without revealing all the personal and private details they now understood. They released a statement acknowledging that an incident had occurred involving access to archived royal items and that internal procedures were being reviewed. They emphasized that no laws had been broken and that the matter was being handled appropriately within the household. The statement did little to quell public speculation. People wanted answers. What exactly had happened? Why had Camilla been in a restricted area? What items had she been handling? The lack of specific details only fueled more dramatic theories. Some accused her of attempting to steal valuable jewelry for personal gain. Others suggested she was trying to claim items that rightfully belonged to other members of the royal family. The internet became a battleground of opinions, with defenders and critics clashing over what the truth might be. Inside the palace, the pressure was immense. Camilla remained largely out of public view, canceling scheduled appearances and engagements. The strain showed on King Charles as well, though he maintained his official duties with professional composure. Behind closed doors, however, he struggled with how to protect his wife while also maintaining the integrity of the institution he had inherited. James Miller found himself at the center of unwanted attention. Some media outlets had identified him as the guard who had reported the incident, though the palace refused to confirm his identity. He received messages from reporters seeking interviews, offers from tabloids willing to pay for his story. He declined them all, feeling deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight. His only crime had been doing his job, and now he felt caught between loyalty to the institution and sympathy for the woman whose private moment of grief he had exposed. The palace staff was divided in their reactions. Some felt Camilla had been treated unfairly, that the press coverage was cruel and based on incomplete information. Others maintained that protocols existed for good reasons, and that even sympathetic circumstances did not excuse violations. The tension created an uncomfortable working environment, with colleagues who had worked together harmoniously for years now finding themselves on opposite sides of a debate about accountability versus compassion. A week after the incident became public, King Charles made a decision. He authorized the release of additional information that would provide context without violating his wife's privacy. The palace announced that the late Queen had left specific items to various family members, including Queen Camilla, but that administrative oversights had delayed the proper distribution of these personal effects. The statement explained that the incident had occurred when the Queen consort attempted to access items that had been designated for her but not yet delivered through official channels. This new information shifted the narrative significantly. Many who had been quick to condemn Camilla now expressed sympathy. The story transformed from one of possible theft to one of bureaucratic failure and human grief. Editorial columns that had been harshly critical began offering more nuanced perspectives. Some commentators apologized for rushing to judgment without knowing the full facts. However, not everyone was satisfied with this explanation. Critics argued that regardless of the circumstances, Camilla should have waited for proper procedures rather than taking matters into her own hands. They pointed out that her position gave her access to resources and people who could have helped resolve the situation legally and appropriately. The debate continued, revealing deeper divisions about expectations for royal behavior and accountability. Camilla herself remained silent publicly, but those close to her reported that she was devastated by the scandal. She had never intended for her private moment of grief to become a public spectacle. The violation of her privacy felt as significant as the violation of protocol she had committed. She struggled with guilt over the trouble she had caused, anger at the system that had failed to deliver her items properly, and sadness over the way her relationship with the late queen was being dissected in the media. King Charles visited his wife one evening, finding her sitting alone in her private sitting room, Elizabeth's letter in her hands. She had read it dozens of times, finding comfort in words that felt like a lifeline from someone who had understood the unique challenges of her position. Charles sat beside her, and for the first time since the incident, they talked openly about everything that had happened. Camilla admitted that she had made a terrible mistake in judgment. She should have asked him for help, should have trusted that the items would eventually reach her through proper channels, but she had felt so uncertain about her right to ask, so worried about seeming greedy or inappropriate, that she had convinced herself that taking matters into her own hands was the only solution. She apologized not just for breaking protocols but for putting him in an impossible position. Charles acknowledged the failures of the system as well. His mother's wishes should have been honored promptly and properly. The fact that Camilla had felt unable to simply ask for what was rightfully hers spoke to larger problems in how the household operated and communicated. He promised that changes would be made to ensure that personal bequests from family members were handled with priority and care. James Miller was called to a private meeting with King Charles. He went nervously, unsure what to expect. Charles thanked him for his diligence and professionalism. He explained that James had done exactly what he should have done under the circumstances. There would be no negative consequences for his actions. In fact, Charles wanted to emphasize that the integrity James had shown in reporting the incident, regardless of who was involved, was exactly the kind of ethical behavior the palace needed from its staff. James left the meeting with mixed feelings. He was relieved that he would not face any career repercussions, and he felt validated that his actions had been appropriate. But he could not shake the uncomfortable feeling that his simple act of following protocol had triggered such enormous consequences for so many people. He understood intellectually that he had done nothing wrong, but emotionally, he still felt like an unwitting catalyst for a crisis. As the media storm continued, public opinion remained split. Polls showed that roughly half of Britons believed Camilla had been treated too harshly, while the other half felt she had not been held sufficiently accountable. The incident had touched on deeper questions about privilege, accountability, grief, and forgiveness. It revealed how even in one of the most carefully managed institutions in the world, human emotions and flaws could create situations that no amount of protocol could fully control or prevent. The palace announced that an independent review of archival procedures would be conducted to prevent similar situations in the future. New protocols would be established for handling personal bequests from deceased family members. Communication channels would be improved to ensure that items designated for specific individuals would be delivered promptly and properly. These practical measures were important, but they could not erase what had already happened or fully repair the damage to trust and relationships that the incident had caused. 3 months after the incident, life at the palace had settled into a new normal, though the effects of that November morning continued to ripple through the institution in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. The independent review of archival procedures had been completed, resulting in a comprehensive overhaul of how personal items and bequests were handled. A new position had been created specifically to manage family heirlooms and ensure that the wishes of deceased royals were honored promptly and properly. Queen Camilla had returned to her public duties, though she moved through them with a new awareness of vulnerability. The scandal had humanized her in ways that years of public service had not. People who saw her now recognized not just a queen, but a woman who had made a mistake born of grief and impatience. Some found this relatability endearing. Others remained critical, believing that such human moments were luxuries that royalty could not afford. She kept Elizabeth's letter in a private drawer in her study, taking it out to read during difficult moments. The words offered comfort and guidance that helped her navigate the complicated aftermath of the incident. Elizabeth had written about the loneliness that sometimes came with royal duty, the feeling of being constantly observed and judged, and the importance of finding small moments of authentic connection with the past and with oneself. Reading these words, Camilla felt understood in a way that was both painful and healing. The pearl necklace that she had been holding that morning now sat in a velvet-lined box on her dressing table. It had been officially transferred to her, along with several other items that Elizabeth had designated for her. Each time Camilla looked at these objects, she experienced a complicated mixture of joy and sorrow. They were gifts from someone she had valued, but they had come at such a high cost to her reputation and peace of mind. James Miller had been quietly promoted, a recognition of both his professionalism during the incident and the palace's desire to show that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. He now served in a supervisory role, training new guards and emphasizing the importance of following protocols regardless of circumstances. The experience had matured him, giving him a deeper understanding of the complex human dynamics that existed behind the formal structures of palace life. One afternoon, James encountered Queen Camilla in one of the palace corridors. For a moment, they both froze, the memory of that November morning hanging between them. Then Camilla approached him directly. She thanked him for doing his duty that morning, acknowledging that he had been placed in an impossible position through no fault of his own. She told him that while the incident had been painful, it had ultimately led to important changes that would benefit the institution and future family members. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had carried guilt about the situation for months, second-guessing his actions despite assurances that he had done nothing wrong. Hearing Camilla's words of gratitude rather than resentment helped him finally make peace with what had happened. They parted with mutual respect, each understanding that they had both been caught in a situation that neither had wanted or anticipated. The sitting room where the incident had occurred underwent changes as well. It was no longer kept as an untouchable shrine to Queen Elizabeth. Instead, it was transformed into a living memorial space where family members could visit, remember, and connect with objects that held personal meaning. The room was still secured and access was still logged, but the atmosphere shifted from one of pure preservation to one of active remembrance. Other family members, who had been mentioned in Elizabeth's notes, received their designated items through the new improved system. Each delivery came with a personal letter explaining the significance of the items and Elizabeth's wishes for their care and use. These moments of connection with the late Queen helped the family heal from their collective grief in ways that might not have happened without the crisis that had forced the palace to confront its administrative failures. The media eventually moved on to other stories, though the incident remained a reference point in discussions about royal protocol and accountability. Historians and commentators would analyze it for years to come, using it as a case study in how institutions balance tradition with human needs, and how even the most carefully structured systems can fail when they lose sight of the people they are meant to serve. King Charles reflected often on the lessons of those tumultuous weeks. The incident had revealed weaknesses in palace procedures that needed addressing, but it had also demonstrated the resilience and capacity for growth within the institution. He implemented regular reviews of all major protocols, ensuring that they served their intended purposes without creating unnecessary barriers or suffering. More personally, the crisis had strengthened his relationship with Camilla. They had weathered a significant storm together, learning to communicate more openly about needs, fears, and mistakes. Charles made a conscious effort to ensure that his wife felt supported and heard within the complex machinery of royal life. He recognized that her isolation and uncertainty had contributed to the choices she made that November morning, and he was determined to prevent similar circumstances in the future. For the palace staff, the incident served as a reminder of their collective humanity. Rules and protocols were important, but so was remembering that the people they served were not just symbols or figurehead, but real individuals with real emotions and needs. The division that had briefly split the staff gradually healed, replaced by a shared commitment to doing better and serving both the institution and the people within it. Dr. Helena Morrison continued her work as archivist, but with a renewed sense of purpose. She implemented new systems for flagging personal bequests and ensuring they were communicated promptly to relevant parties. She also began documenting the stories behind objects in the collection, recognizing that the human connections and emotions attached to these items were as important as their historical or monetary value. On the first anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death, a small private ceremony was held in the sitting room. King Charles, Queen Camilla, and a few senior staff members gathered to remember Elizabeth and reflect on the year that had passed. Camilla wore the pearl necklace for the first time, feeling both the weight of its history and the comfort of its connection to someone she had lost. She spoke briefly about Elizabeth's kindness and wisdom, about the lessons learned from both her life and the complicated aftermath of her death. She acknowledged her own mistakes and the pain they had caused, but also expressed gratitude for the changes that had resulted. The incident, painful as it had been, had ultimately honored Elizabeth's memory by forcing the palace to better care for the personal wishes and emotional needs of its people. As the ceremony concluded and people filed out of the room, James Miller passed by the doorway on his patrol route. He paused for a moment, remembering that November morning when he had discovered Camilla with the jewelry box. So much had changed since then, both for him personally and for the institution he served. The chaos of that discovery had eventually led to clarity about what truly mattered, not just preserving the past perfectly, but honoring it in ways that served the living. He continued his patrol, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors just as they had on that fateful morning. But now he walked with greater confidence and understanding. He had learned that doing the right thing was not always comfortable or simple, and that sometimes the most important moments in life came from unexpected encounters that forced everyone involved to grow and change. The palace would continue its traditions and protocols, but it would do so with greater wisdom about the human hearts that beat within its ancient walls.